On Thanksgiving, my parents looked me straight in the eye, blocked the front entrance, and said, "You're not invited, go home." Behind them, I saw my sister, my uncle, even my best friend laughing around the table like I never existed. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I just nodded, walked back to my car, and made one quick phone call. 20 minutes later, my phone blew up, and the screaming started. What happened next didn't just break my family. It exposed everything they'd tried to bury for years. Before I share my story, I want to know you're here with me. Just say listening in the comments or tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far my story can reach. Sometimes even the smallest connection can make a story feel heard. Thank you. And now, here's my story. I'm James Holt, and if my story reaches you today, please consider subscribing. It helps this channel keep telling the kind of truths most families would do anything to hide. Growing up in the Holt family in Silverleaf, Scottsdale felt like living inside a glass house polished every hour of the day. Everything had to be perfect. My father, Dorian Holt, was the kind of man people stood up straighter around a walking symbol of power and generational money. My mother, Maris, didn't command a room through fear the way he did, but through image. Every detail mattered to her, from the way she folded napkins at dinner parties to the way her children were supposed to smile in public. And then there was my sister, Averly Harvard, polished Wharton-refined Holt Capital's future CEO before she even signed her first employment contract. And then there was me, James Holt, the one who liked storytelling more than spreadsheets, branding more than balance sheets, the one who never fit the family mold and never pretended I could. 8 months before this Thanksgiving night, I walked out of Holt Capital after a humiliating blowout argument with my father in front of senior partners. I'd spent years trying to prove my worth as director of client strategy, but it didn't matter. To him, marketing was a hobby, not a real industry, and I was the son who'd strayed too far from the family legacy. I left that day with nothing but dignity and a few boxes of my own things, and within a week I threw myself into building something that was fully mine. Holt Creative Agency, a small marketing firm in Tempe. My family saw it as betrayal. I saw it as breathing for the first time. Still, somewhere deep down, I kept a tiny sliver of hope that we could heal. Thanksgiving felt like the right moment to try, so I dressed the way my mother always approved: navy sweater, crisp shirt, and baked a chocolate bourbon pie the way my father liked it, even though he would never call it his favorite unless Averly made it. I picked out a bottle of wine from a client's vineyard, rehearsing possible conversations on the drive. Maybe tonight would be the start of something different. But that hope lasted only until I stepped onto the porch of the Silverleaf estate. I stood there holding my pie and the bottle of wine, heart pounding harder than it should have. My father opened the door, my mother just behind him, both blocking the entrance like I was a stranger selling something they didn't want. Their expressions were colder than the November air. My father didn't hesitate. "You're not invited. Go home." My mother followed with, "This isn't a night for you, James." For a moment I stood frozen. Then, through the narrow space between them, I saw the dining room, the warm lights, the perfectly set table, and Lysander Price, my best friend for a decade, sitting in my seat, laughing with my sister and my Uncle Rowan like he had always belonged there more than I ever did. None of them saw me. None of them knew how badly it cut. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't ask why. I simply nodded, turned around, walked down those stone steps, and placed my pie carefully on the passenger seat, as if it still mattered. When I started the car, I didn't drive away immediately. Instead, I made one decision, the one thing they never expected from me. I dialed a single number. Kieran Vance, a friend from college who now worked at the SEC. As soon as the call connected, everything began to change. I drove away from Silverleaf without a destination, letting instinct take the wheel until I ended up at Tempe Town Lake. I parked facing the water, watching the city lights ripple across the surface as I tried to steady my breathing. The humiliation at the front door still burned, but underneath it was something else, something older. Old wounds, old questions, old truths I had ignored for far too long. Sitting in that quiet, I let my mind drift back to the months before I left Holt Capital. I remembered the long nights in the office as director of client strategy doing twice the work for half the credit. I remembered desperately wanting my father to see that my approach to business through branding storytelling connection had value. He never did. To him, numbers ruled all. And the only person who ever made me feel like I wasn't delusional for trying was Lysander, my best friend, my confidant, my supposed ally. Then came the night everything shifted. I was preparing a pitch deck for a massive client cross-checking data in the internal system long after most of the building had gone dark. That was when I found an offshore transaction buried in a folder I shouldn't have had access to its designation marked restricted. At first I thought it was a mistake. I asked my father about it the next morning and he dismissed me with a single sentence. "You don't understand. This is grown-up business." But the next morning my access privileges had been revoked entirely. Overnight, the system logged me out of nearly every financial file. Someone wanted me blind, and the only person who suddenly wouldn't meet my eyes was Lysander, who told me quietly, "Let it go, man. It's not your lane." I didn't let it go. Instead, I confronted my father, and the shouting match that followed ended my time at Holt Capital. For months afterward, I tried to hold on to my affection for my family, believing they would see my worth someday. I poured myself into Holt Creative Agency, pushing through the early struggle until clients started knocking. I was proud of myself, even if my family pretended not to notice. But sitting in my car that night at Tempe Town Lake, I realized something I had conveniently forgotten. On the night I found those offshore transactions, I panicked. I didn't know what I was looking at, but something in me knew it wasn't right. So I copied the files onto an external hard drive without telling anyone. A just-in-case impulse. Then I hid the drive deep in my apartment and never touched it again. Until now. Until my family shut the door in my face. Until I saw Lysander sitting in my seat. Until I made that call to Kieran. That was the moment I knew whatever I had tried to bury 8 months ago, I was going to have to dig it up. And this time there was no turning back. Sitting in my car at Tempe Town Lake, the glow from the water barely reached through the windshield, but it was enough to show how badly my hands were shaking when I dialed Kieran's number. I hadn't spoken to him in months, and the moment he picked up, I heard the surprise in his voice when I whispered that I needed to see him. There was no small talk, no pretense. I told him plainly, almost breathless, that something was wrong and I needed help. He reminded me instantly of a night 3 months earlier when I rambled drunkenly about strange transactions I'd stumbled across at Holt Capital. He'd asked back then if I had kept any copies, and I had lied, telling him I deleted everything because I didn't want to create trouble. That lie dissolved the second I said the truth aloud tonight. I told him I did have a backup, and that I finally realized why my family had pushed me out so aggressively. Kieran didn't hesitate. He told me to meet him at the SEC office in Phoenix at 8 the next morning. Hearing his voice steady and factual made everything more real, like I'd crossed an invisible line just by making the call. But before I had time to process it, the moment I hung up, my phone lit up like it had caught fire. Dozens of messages flooded in at once, buzzing non-stop against my palm. The first notifications came from the Holt Capital internal system. I still had partial access to alerts showing the company's servers being frozen under federal order. The internal database was locked down. File transfers halted. It was the kind of disruption that sent shockwaves through an entire financial firm in seconds. Then came the personal messages. My father's voice erupted through my screen in all caps, asking what I had done. Averly followed with sharper words telling me to stop whatever I was doing because I was destroying everything Holt Capital had built. She added that Lysander was falling apart and that none of us would recover from this if I didn't pull back immediately. Then Lysander's messages appeared, soft, frantic pleading. He asked to meet. He said he never wanted anything to turn out this way. His tone was desperate, completely at odds with the image of him casually laughing in my seat just hours before. Each message from him made my stomach twist because every word felt like a performance meant for someone else's script, not for the friend he used to be. But the message that froze me wasn't from any of them. It was from my cousin Nora. She wrote that right after I was turned away at the front door, Uncle Rowan got up from the table and left without a word, his face pale and tight. She warned me that something had been wrong inside the family for a long time, that the fear hanging over that dinner wasn't because of me, it was because they knew something was coming. They just didn't expect it to be me who triggered it. For the first time that night, I understood that the rejection at the door was not spontaneous or emotional. It was strategic, calculated. And the conflict between me and my family didn't start tonight. It started long before I realized I'd been pulled into it. Whatever this was, I wasn't stepping into a fight. I had been living inside one for months without even knowing it. I drove home from the lake in silence, replaying the messages again and again until they no longer sounded like words from people I knew. When I walked into my apartment, the quiet felt heavier than usual, almost like it was waiting for me to decide what came next. The biggest question circling my mind wasn't about Holt Capital. It was about my family. Why did they seem more afraid of me asking questions than of any actual investigation? Why did the idea of me knowing the truth terrify them enough to shut me out completely? I went straight to the hidden compartment in my bookshelf and pulled out the external drive I'd shoved there 8 months ago. Back then, I didn't understand what I had found, only that it felt wrong and that I might need it someday. Tonight was that day. I plugged it into my laptop, and as the files opened, a strange calm settled over me. I knew that by reading what was inside, I was choosing a path I couldn't undo. Once I saw it, I wouldn't be able to unsee it. The first documents were spreadsheets showing offshore transactions tied to major clients Holt Capital managed. At first glance, they looked normal, structured, tidy. But the deeper I looked, the more the numbers unraveled. Funds moved through multiple shell entities with no clear purpose. Large withdrawals were disguised as adjustments. Entire sections of transactions were marked for restricted viewing, yet somehow my account had logged them. Then I found the internal emails that should have been deleted from the company servers. Discussions about shifting performance reports, elevating returns on paper, and fabricating explanations for clients who questioned sudden changes. Then I found something with my name on it. Transactions listing me as a secondary approver on multi-million-dollar transfers. Digital signatures attached to my account. Authentication tokens that should have required my explicit involvement. But I had never seen these transactions before tonight. Someone had used my identity. Someone had positioned me within the scheme without my knowledge. My chest tightened as I clicked deeper. There were emails between my father and Averly discussing how to manage me. They wrote about restricting my access, steering me away from certain accounts, and monitoring any questions I asked. Reading my sister's words felt like reading a stranger's commentary on my life. She wrote that I was becoming unreliable, that I needed to be redirected, handled, watched. Then I opened another folder. This one held private emails between Averly and Lysander. I had braced myself for many things that night, but not this. They were together. They had been together for months, and they talked casually about how my sentimental attachment to Lysander made manipulating me easier. They discussed transferring my client relationships to him and how he could step into my position at Holt Capital with minimal disruption. It was like someone had taken my entire life, scraped away every piece of stability, and repurposed it to build a future that didn't include me at all. I kept digging, needing to see everything. I found a document outlining a succession plan that positioned Lysander as my replacement, complete with client lists that once belonged to me. Then a video file caught my eye. I opened it to find security footage from the office. The grainy clip showed Lysander entering my workspace late at night, plugging a drive into my computer, copying files, and leaving without turning on the lights. Watching him move through my office with such familiarity made my stomach drop. He hadn't just betrayed me. He had studied me, outmaneuvered me. At the bottom of the folder was a final document written in stiff clinical language. It said that if I continued asking questions or attempting to access restricted files, action must be taken before exposure becomes a threat. The meaning wasn't spelled out, but it didn't need to be. They were prepared to eliminate me from the equation long before tonight's scene at the door. By the time I closed my laptop, the room felt colder. This wasn't about a disagreement or a family argument spiraling out of control. It was about power. It was about control. It was about a system my family had been building in the shadows for years, one they couldn't risk me uncovering. And now that I had everything, suddenly made sense. The rejection, the distance, the surveillance, the sudden shift in how everyone treated me. I realized something else too. Tonight wasn't the beginning of my downfall, it was the beginning of theirs. My phone kept ringing long after the house lights at Silverleaf faded from my rearview mirror. Call after call, notification after notification. Dozens of missed calls from my parents and Averly stacked over each other, each one carrying more urgency than the last. Messages from Lysander appeared too begging to meet, privately claiming he needed to explain. I ignored every one of them. I couldn't talk to any of them until I understood the scope of what I'd uncovered. I turned back to the files on my laptop and opened the folder labeled Trust Fund 2019-2023. I had never imagined this was something I needed to investigate. My grandparents created that fund for me when I was a child, and it was supposed to be locked until I turned 35. But the documents on the screen showed withdrawals, large ones, taken repeatedly over the last 2 years. My name appeared as the authorizing signature, digitally verified, but I knew instantly that none of those signatures were mine. Someone inside the family had forged my approval. Then I opened an email chain between my father and Averly. The words made me feel physically sick. Ensure James never discovers the trust withdrawals. We need that capital to maintain liquidity. They took what wasn't theirs. They took what belonged to me. Not because they needed it for survival, but because my father refused to let his empire show signs of weakness. And my sister participated without hesitation. The betrayal felt deeper than anything I'd seen in the financial documents. They hadn't just deceived clients. They had stolen from their own blood. I stepped out onto my balcony, the desert air cool against my face, as I tried to process what this meant. If I cooperated with the SEC, my entire family would face consequences they wouldn't recover from. If I stayed silent, I would become complicit, another Holt defending a collapsing house of lies. Neither option felt like a victory. But only one of them allowed me to keep my integrity intact. My phone vibrated again. This time it was my cousin Nora. Her voice was hushed, tense. She told me the family had been discussing ways to phase me out for months, even before I left Holt Capital. She said there had been arguments about how much I knew, and the plan had always been to keep me out of anything important so I couldn't cause trouble. Rowan, she said, was the only one who opposed it. But he'd been silenced by pressure from my father and Averly. Then Nora told me something that twisted the knife deeper. Averly had been planning for months to position Lysander as my permanent replacement, not just in the company, in the family hierarchy. They saw him as the strategic choice, someone loyal, controllable, compatible with the Holt image. I wasn't part of that plan. I wasn't supposed to be part of it. The more Nora spoke, the clearer it became. Tonight wasn't emotional. It wasn't impulsive. It was orchestrated. A clean removal. They needed me completely out of the way before someone else asked the same questions I had. Before we hung up, Nora delivered one last warning. She said someone in the family was going to reach out to me tomorrow morning with a proposition, something designed to tie me legally to the fraudulent accounts, so that I couldn't testify without incriminating myself. She told me not to trust anyone. Minutes after I ended the call with her, an anonymous email hit my inbox. Do not trust anyone in the family. Tomorrow they will try to trap you into shared liability. There was no signature, no traceable address. But whoever sent it knew too much to be guessing. Someone somewhere was trying to keep me alive financially, legally, maybe even physically. I turned back to the files and scrolled through the last document in the trust folder. My heart stopped when I saw it. One of the fraudulent transactions tied directly to a client account I had managed before resigning. Anyone looking at the surface level would assume I approved it. My identity had been carefully positioned as the ideal scapegoat. In that moment, everything clicked. My family didn't want me back. They wanted me silent. My absence protected them. My voice destroyed them. And now that I had spoken, they were desperate. It was a little past 10 when the doorbell rang. The sound cut through my apartment like a knife. I walked to the door, slowly looked through the peephole, and felt my breath catch. My entire family stood in the hallway, my father, my mother, Averly, Lysander, and Rowan. Their faces were drained of color, stripped of their usual composure. The Holt arrogance was gone, replaced with something rawer. Fear. Panic. I opened the door because running wasn't an option anymore. My father pushed his way inside without waiting for permission, demanding to know what I'd done. His voice echoed off the walls, sharp enough to slice through the tension in the room. My mother followed, trying and failing to maintain her calm. Her hands trembled as she smoothed her hair back, a nervous tic she only displayed in moments of absolute crisis. They didn't come to apologize. They didn't come because they missed me. They came because Holt Capital was being investigated by the SEC tonight. My call to Kieran had triggered an immediate preservation order on the company's systems. Documents were frozen, emails were locked, servers were seized. Years of hidden misconduct were suddenly exposed to federal scrutiny. Everly rounded on me, first accusing me of selfishness and betrayal. She said the family had built everything with sacrifice and I had torn it down in one evening. Lysander stood beside her like a shadow, his eyes fixed on the floor, unable to look at me. My father cut through the noise with a single offer. If I retracted everything, if I contacted the SEC and said this was all a misunderstanding, they would handle the trust fund problem and let it go. It was the closest he had ever come to admitting wrongdoing. He didn't even try to deny they took my money. He simply framed it as leverage. I turned to Lysander because a part of me still needed an answer. I asked him why he had done it, why he had betrayed me so completely. He broke then, crying in a way that felt rehearsed, softened by guilt, but shaped by the need to appear sympathetic. He said he loved Everly. He said the family pressured him. He said he didn't know how to stop once he agreed to help. His words didn't bring relief. They brought clarity. He had chosen them every step of the way. He had chosen the power, the position, the proximity to the Holt name. Our friendship had been useful to him until the moment it wasn't. Then something unexpected happened. Rowan stepped forward, his voice firm for the first time in years. He told my father and sister that I had evidence that the SEC had been preparing for this investigation long before I called. He told them they were wrong if they thought intimidation or manipulation could fix what had already been set in motion. It was the first time anyone in the family had stood on my side, and the room shifted instantly. The argument exploded. My father blamed Everly for mishandling the accounts. Everly blamed him for ignoring her warnings. Lysander blamed both of them for dragging him into the mess. My mother begged them all to stop, but her voice was drowned out. Their empire was collapsing one accusation at a time, and there was no order left to protect them. Then, in the middle of the chaos, my father turned on me with a fury I had never seen before. He told me I was no longer a Holt, that by involving the SEC I had severed every tie. His words were meant to break me, but they didn't. They clarified everything. I looked him in the eye and told him the truth he refused to hear. I hadn't belonged to the Holt family from the moment he closed that door in my face earlier that night. When they finally walked out of my apartment, the silence they left behind wasn't peace. It was the beginning of something much larger, a war they had created, and one I was finally ready to finish. The morning after the confrontation at my apartment came far too quickly. I had slept no more than 3 hours, slipping in and out of shallow dreams that felt more like warnings than rest. When my alarm rang at 6, I got up, immediately gathered every file, every printed email, every drive, and placed them neatly into a secured folder. I knew exactly what I was walking into, and there was a strange clarity in accepting that doing the right thing would cost me something I couldn't predict. I arrived at the SEC office in Phoenix just before 8. Kieran met me in a private room, his expression grave but steady. I handed over everything. Then I told him everything from the night I found the offshore transfers to the locked accounts to the Thanksgiving door slammed in my face. He didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he leaned forward and said the evidence was more than enough to launch a full federal investigation. Then he told me something I hadn't expected. The SEC had been monitoring Holt Capital for 6 months, suspecting irregularities but unable to prove anything without inside support. They needed someone on the inside who knew what the system looked like from the family's perspective. I wasn't just reporting wrongdoing. I had become a key witness. Things began moving fast. By mid-morning, the SEC issued a freeze order on every Holt Capital corporate account. Executives were summoned for urgent questioning. IT servers were secured before anyone could alter data. Meanwhile, Holt Capital's legal team called me repeatedly offering to clarify misunderstandings, but I declined every call. Then I made a choice of my own. I emailed 3 clients I had worked closely with before leaving the company, clients who trusted my judgment. My email was brief, suggesting they review their accounts and be prepared for possible communication from federal authorities. I didn't tell them the details, but they understood enough. Word spread faster inside the firm than any official announcement could. By noon, panic had settled into every corner of Holt Capital. Someone leaked audio from an internal emergency meeting. In it, my father's voice thundered through the recording, shouting that I was the only person who could fix this mess. But no one in the room responded. Not one voice supported him. His authority, once absolute, had evaporated. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a long string of messages from my mother. She begged me to reconsider what I was doing. She insisted that this wasn't just about the company, it was about the family name, our reputation, everything they had built. Her words weren't about truth. They were about image. And for the first time I felt the full weight of how little she understood me. Later that afternoon, Averly emailed me directly. The tone was unlike anything she had written before. She admitted she had made mistakes, that she had been pushed into decisions she didn't fully support. She said she never wanted things to reach this point. But she also didn't say who had pressured her, or how much she had contributed willingly. It was a confession without responsibility, and it left me questioning what she hoped to gain by telling me now. By early evening, news outlets across Phoenix and Scottsdale released statements confirming that Holt Capital was under federal investigation. Headlines exploded across screens dissecting the fall of a prestigious financial empire. Photos of my father and sister appeared everywhere. Reports speculated on fraud, misconduct, and internal conflict. Just when I thought the day couldn't unravel further, Kieran called again. His voice was steady but weighted. He told me my father had admitted to orchestrating financial manipulation for at least 5 years. But instead of owning the entirety of it, he claimed I had played a role. He was trying to fold me into the narrative as part of his defense. That moment clarified everything. My father's last move wasn't an act of desperation, it was an attack. And if I didn't push forward to the end, he would bury me along with the truth. There was no turning back now. The next morning, I made my final decision. I submitted additional testimony to the SEC, accompanied by full digital evidence confirming that I had never signed the transactions attached to my name. I included screen recordings, timestamp logs, and authentication discrepancies proving the signatures had been forged. This was the last step to protect myself before the legal storm reached its peak. When the first federal hearing took place, I stood before the panel and walked them through each detail: how I discovered the anomalies, how my access was revoked, how my name was used without consent. Lysander testified after me, but his statements faltered under the weight of the documents I had already provided. His answers contradicted the emails he'd written. His demeanor cracked under scrutiny. Averly's turn came next. She avoided my eyes the entire time. Her voice shook. She answered questions, carefully distancing herself from the decisions she once participated in. My father sat rigid beside her, arms crossed, his jaw clenched. He tried to maintain his image as the unshakable patriarch, but even from across the room I could see the tremor in his hands. The investigations progressed quickly. The first findings showed that the unauthorized withdrawals from my trust fund originated from internal credentials only my father and Averly possessed. The evidence undercut their attempts to implicate me. They shifted from offense to defense in an instant. Weeks later, federal investigators uncovered 2 additional board members involved in the long-running fraud. Suddenly, Holt Capital's corruption was no longer a family scandal. It was a systemic collapse involving senior leadership. I realized my father had not been operating alone. The rot ran far deeper than I had imagined. The family began to unravel. My father was placed under house arrest as a precaution against flight risk. Averly resigned, packed her things, and quietly left Arizona for treatment someplace out of state. My mother retreated to Sedona, shielding herself from the public eye, unable to cope with the shattering of the Holt image. Meanwhile, my life moved forward in ways I hadn't expected. Holt Creative Agency flourished. Clients appreciated my transparency and integrity after the scandal, and business grew faster than I could have imagined. Then I received an unexpected offer from Holt Capital's restructuring committee, an invitation to serve on the new oversight board, helping rebuild the company with a foundation rooted in ethical practice. Accepting the position felt symbolic, like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been denied for years. Nearly a year later, as Autumn returned to the desert, I received a handwritten letter from Everly. In it, she confessed that the family had been forced into impossible decisions during a financial crisis in 2019. My father demanded loyalty above all else, insisting that sacrifices had to be made to maintain the Holt empire. She wrote that she regretted her part in what happened and didn't expect forgiveness, only understanding. Her words didn't erase the damage, but they illuminated the fear and pressure she'd lived under. That Thanksgiving, I hosted my own dinner at the townhouse I had purchased in Tempe. There was no polished silverware, no rehearsed speeches, no pretentious menu, just warmth, just sincerity. I invited Kieran, Nora, Rowan, and a few trusted colleagues who had supported me during the worst days. As we ate, I realized that for the first time in my life, I was surrounded by a family I had chosen, not one I had been obligated to belong to. After dinner, while helping clear the table, Rowan approached me quietly. He told me the new board at Holt Capital wanted me to take a larger voting role, someone they believed represented the values the company needed to rebuild. He looked me in the eyes and said, "James, sometimes things have to fall apart so you can rebuild them the right way." In that moment, I understood something profound. My journey with the Holt family wasn't ending. It was transforming. And for the first time, I was the one defining what came next. What struck me most in the months that followed wasn't the fall of Holt Capital, or the headlines, or the courtroom tension. It was the quiet moments. The mornings when I woke without dread. The nights when I didn't second-guess every breath. The realization that peace doesn't come when everything is finally fixed. It comes when you finally decide to stop carrying what was never yours to hold. For years I thought loyalty meant endurance, that family meant obligation, that love required silence. But standing here now, 1 year later, with my own life built on my own terms, I finally understand that none of that was true. Loyalty without truth is just fear dressed as devotion. Family without accountability is just a cage with nicer furniture. Healing doesn't come from